One of my favourite styles of photography is seascapes. It's probably because they are so accessible. Where most Australians live, it's right on the coast, so visiting the beach and appreciating the ocean is part of our culture. So as a landscape photographer in Australia, it's not surprising that a lot of my images are of seascapes. I also enjoy the challenge that seascapes provide. Not only that, but every time I go down to my local beach, it's different each time. There's always new compositions to look for, and the beach itself is changing as the seasons change and as the tides change as well. And you've got different elements you're battling with, like the wind. Sometimes the sea spray is hitting the lens and the camera. And also if you're taking a sunrise or a sunset, you've got a limitation of time. So there's a lot of action and a lot of drama in these seascapes, and I think that gets the adrenaline up, and that's why I enjoy it. And you can get some great looking images, some nice effects with the movement of the water, and I think that's why I like seascapes. So in this video I'm going to tell you my 7 tips on how to improve your seascape images, and hopefully you can learn a tip or a trick along the way. Tip number 1 is to take a wide angle lens. Now I typically shoot with this is the Nikon 17-35, and when I'm down at the beach I'm usually at around about somewhere between 20 and 17, so I'm pretty wide out. The reason why this is so good is that most seascapes or most beaches, they're quite wide. Your actual location is quite wide, and so a wide angle lens will compress and capture all of the information, all of the elements and the feature in that location, and include it in your image. If I need to go wider than the 17, then I've got this here, which is my 14-24, but I don't have the lenses for this. I don't have the filters for this, but I'll talk about filters in a little while. Now, wide angle lenses are no good if you've got something that's off in the distance that you want to make a fairly significant part of your image, because it is so wide, it compresses and compacts all of the scene into the image, and it makes your subject off in the distance, say it's a set of mountains, really, really small. But for seascapes, that's not a problem, because usually right off in the distance is just the horizon. Where all the interest is in your image is in the foreground. It might be rocks, it might be details in the rocks, cracks or patterns in the sand, or even the movement of the water. And all that's happening really, really close to the camera. So a wide angle lens is really good for, again, making sure that all of that interest and all of that foreground is included in your image. If you're lucky enough, you'll also have lots of cloud in the sky that is reflecting the colours from the sun. And a wide angle lens will make sure that it will capture as much of that sky as possible, and make sure that it is a nice feature as part of your image. So that's why I recommend a wide angle lens. One of the really interesting features that I like to photograph when I'm shooting seascapes is the moving water. Ooh, let me just steady things as the water goes past me, and here comes another big wave. And so tip number 2 is to make sure you get wet. It's a bit of a reminder of how close you need to get to the water to make sure that that moving water and the crashing waves is a really nice feature of your final image. If you're too far back, then you'll get the water in your image, but it's not going to be as interesting. So make sure that you move your camera, the lens, the tripod, and you walk into the water to make sure that the movement of the water, the crashing waves, is moving underneath the lens. The moving water creates a pattern, and if it's moving underneath the lens, it's a pattern that is at the bottom of your image, and it's creating a great interest and usually some leading lines that leads the eye of the viewer into the rest of the image. So make sure you get wet. If you're not wet at the end of your Seascape shoot, you're probably not doing it right. Life lesson, I think. Of course, if you're going to get wet, then it's going to make things a little bit tricky. Make sure you've got the right clothes on and you're going to be warm enough. We're lucky here in Australia, we don't have to worry too much about that. I can stand in the water pretty much all year round and not get too cold. But obviously if you're in other areas of the world and it gets a lot colder, then you're going to need the right gear to make sure that you don't get too cold. You're also going to need plenty of lens cloths to make sure that any splashes that come up, and inevitably you are going to get some drops on the front of your lens, make sure you wipe them off, because the last thing you want to do is get home and find that all your images are ruined with spots that either you need to throw the image out or you need to spend hours and hours and hours trying to remove those spots. So the other thing, I suppose, is to make sure that your camera and your lens is somewhat weather sealed or water resistant to at least a little bit of spray. Of course, if you do get sea spray on your lens and your camera, when you get home, make sure you wipe that off and keep it clean, because nothing will ruin your camera quicker than salty water. Tip number 3 is to do with considering how you're going to capture the movement of the water. Let's talk about general camera settings. Keep in mind that these are general approaches. Every seascape is going to be unique, every location is going to be unique, and so therefore it's going to mean that you're going to have to go in there and assess what settings are suitable and what composition is suitable. But to talk about my general approach, I always go with the base ISO of the camera. For the Fuji, it's 160. For the Nikon, it's 64. The reason why you choose the base ISO is you want the best image. I don't like to go below the base. Some cameras have a low and a couple of steps below that, but you lose dynamic range. So I always stick with the base ISO. I tend to go for a shutter speed of somewhere between 1/3 of a second and around about 2/3 of a second, depending of course on how much water there is and how fast it's moving. If I have a lot of water or it's moving quite quickly, then I'll tend to go for a faster shutter speed, because I like to keep some detail in the water. I don't like too fast of a shutter speed where it kind of freezes the water. I think that actually looks quite unnatural, but there are some people that prefer that look. I like to have a little bit of movement in my water, but there's still some detail left. So there's some contrast. If the water's running over a rock, there's a contrast between the white foam and the dark rocks. And that contrast, I think, looks quite interesting in an image. Of course, if the water is moving a lot slower, either up or as it's draining back into the sea, then I'll go for a longer shutter speed, 2/3 or even up to a second or even 2. A little bit longer than that and you catch a little bit too much movement in the water and the water starts to look a little bit milky and muddy. So I don't like that either. So I'm somewhere in between 1/3 to 2/3, but as high as a second, and if the water is moving fast, maybe as quick as 1/4 of a second or even 1/6 of a second. Because in a lot of the seascapes that I capture, and I'm quite close to some of the interest, my depth of field has to be relatively big. So whereas I usually might start off at f8 or f10, I might start off at f11, moving through to f14, maybe to f16. Gives me a much larger depth of field to make sure that whatever is in the foreground and also, you know, off in the distance is in focus. Much beyond f16, if you get up to f18, f20 and f22, you start to introduce diffraction, which is not the end of the world, considering that you've got a lot of movement in your image anyway. And as far as I'm concerned, it's more important to capture the image than it be technically correct. That's just my approach. But I tend to try and steer clear of anything up round much beyond f18. f20 is a little bit too much, f22, unless of course I'm trying to specifically go for that starburst in the sun. So with those settings, you might still have too much light to have a shutter speed of somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of a second. So that's where filters come in really handy. So if you've got too much light right across your entire scene, maybe you're shooting well before the sun is setting or well after the sun has risen, and you've got too much light right across the scene, then I'll use a filter like this. This is a neutral density filter, and as you can see, its neutral density is right across the glass here. This is a Lee Filters Pro Glass 6 stop. So I might use that, and that's going to allow me to have a shutter speed. It'll bring it down from 1/30th of a second closer to 1/6 or a quarter of a second. If, of course, you've got a difference in the light, so you've got some darker rock in the foreground and a lighter sky in the top half of your image, then you're going to need a filter similar to this. Now this is a 0.6 hard neutral density graduated filter, and it graduates quite sharply or quite hard, hence the name. And so you'll hopefully be able to pick up there, if I put my hand over it, yeah, you'll pick up that the line is in the middle and it's quite a hard line. When shooting seascapes, your horizon tends to be quite flat. This gets used a lot more than a soft graduated filter. So I'd set that right on the horizon to make sure that the sky is, or the light in the sky is brought down, and allows me to bring up the exposure overall on the image to allow me to get the detail in the rocks, which is going to come through in the bottom half of the filter. So filters are quite handy. Tip number 4 is looking at opportunities to use ambient and reflective light. When I started shooting seascapes, I thought the best light was when the sun was right on the horizon, or just before it set, or just after it rose, so you could see the sun. But over time I realized that there were a lot of other opportunities rather than shooting directly into the sun, where you come up against challenges like flare and blowing out the highlights quite easily. I looked at chances or compositions where I didn't have the sun directly in the image. Of course, there's two ways of doing this. If the sun is above the horizon, what I'll do is I'll turn the camera and look for compositions that are an angle away from directly into the sun, so the sun isn't actually in the image. This means that I'm looking at taking advantage of the light that's reflected off the clouds in the sky, and also some side lighting on the rocks or whatever I have as a feature in the foreground. The other alternative, of course, is to wait for the sun to set, if it's a sunset, or if it's a sunrise that you're shooting, then shooting before the sun actually appears above the horizon. And I do this because, again, the sun isn't in the picture, so therefore I'm not shooting directly into the sun, but also the light that can be reflected, the colors of the light that's reflected off the clouds can be quite strong, quite intense. And I do like that look. So that's what I'll do to avoid shooting directly into the sun. Of course, shooting directly into the sun is sometimes unavoidable, and that's okay. I just need to deal with those challenges like flare and making sure that I protect my highlights. But I always look for those opportunities now where I can take advantage of ambient and reflective light, because generally it seems to be softer, gives me better colors across the scene, and it's just generally nicer to work with. Tip number 5 is about considering which direction the water is flowing when you actually take your shot. When I started taking seascapes, I always waited for the water to crash go up the sand and then start draining back out to sea. And I'd get those interesting lines that kind of created some foreground interest. And that's a really good image. But later on, I started looking at other timings when taking a shot when the waves were actually crashing over the rocks or hitting the sand and actually coming up the beach at quite a pace. That creates a different type of effect. It brings in a different energy into your images, and it can be, if you practice timing your taking the shot when the water is coming towards the camera, can give quite a different look to your images. So I've got some examples of that. This shot here I took when I was at Wade Bay down south, and it's a typical shot where I've waited for the water to crash over the green rocks in the foreground, and now it's draining out to sea, and you can see that the foam, the pattern that the foam is making as the water is draining back out into the ocean, is creating some leading lines, and there's some nice contrast between that soft water movement and the rocks. Only seconds earlier I took this shot, and this shot here is an example where the waves are actually in the process of crashing over those rocks, and it creates a completely different effect. You can see the power of the wave as it's hitting the rock and it's spraying the water towards the camera. Another example is this shot here, where again you can see that the water is making its way through the rocks, and what I've done is I've waited for the water to almost reach the camera itself before I've taken the shot, and so the water is moving towards the camera, and it can create some quite striking patterns that provide this nice foreground interest. Tip number 6 is about using your polarizer. Shouldn't be any surprise that for most shots that I take of seascapes, I use a polarizer. It helps me cut out the glare that I get from any of the wet surfaces like wet rocks or the wet sand in the foreground. But a polarizer will also cut out glare and reflections off the surface of the water, and sometimes I don't want that to actually be the case. I want the surface of the water to actually have a reflection because it's reflecting the colours in the sky, the clouds in the sky. So each time I put the polarizer on, I'm considering carefully what I actually want the effect of the polarizer to have, whether I want to cut through the surface, the glare on the surface of the water to bring through the detail below the surface of the water, or whether I want to have a reflection on a wet surface. Let's have a look at some examples of that. So in this example, which was taken with the Fuji X-T2 at Augusta, you can see that the effect of the polarizer was to cut through the glare not only in the surface of the rocks in the foreground, but also on the surface of the water, because there was all this interesting detail and colour underneath the water that I wanted brought out. So I've got the polarizer fully engaged there, so as much glare can be removed as possible. But if we look at another example, this shot here was taken down at Green's Pool earlier this year. You can see that I've used the polarizer in such a way that it retains the reflection of the clouds in the wet surface of the sand at the bottom of the image here. And this shot here is a similar sort of thing, but this time the reflection or the colours are on the surface of the water in the midground, the pinks and oranges as well as the blues on the right hand side here. And so instead of having the polarizer fully engaged, I've left that reflection and glare there, if you like, because I think it's a nice balance, adds a nice balance to the image. In this shot here, which was taken nearly a year ago down at Smith's Beach, I've got the polarizer carefully adjusted. I can remember that it was only kind of half engaged, so that in the foreground here I can see the details of the rocks which are below the surface of the water, and then on the surface of the water there's still a reflection remaining of the white clouds and the sky moving up towards the midground of the image. So each time I put the polarizer and mount it on the front of the lens, I'm thinking carefully about how much effect I want from that polarizer, whether I want to remove all the glare or whether I want to retain some reflection in the surface of the water. Tip number 6 is about having a strong foreground interest. And I think that can be really important when it comes to seascapes, but as well as other landscape images as well. It's particularly important to have a strong foreground interest when your midground and your background might not necessarily be very important, because it's just the general movement of the waves in the ocean. If you've got a nice sky with some beautiful color being reflected, then that's going to be really, really nice as a background, and a nice foreground or a strong foreground is going to bring some nice balance to that image anyway. So give yourself enough time to be looking around, as well as movement of the water. It might be contrasts between the movement of the water and the detail in the stationary rocks, or it might be just the cracks or interesting detail in the rocks themselves, or the color of the rocks, or algae that's formed over the rocks. All of these sorts of things make some really interesting foreground interest. If you haven't got rocks, there might be patterns in the sand that was created by the water as it drained back out to sea. Anything like that, creating a little bit of foreground interest that anchors the image is really nice to have in a strong seascape image. So give yourself enough time to explore around and look for those sort of details along the beach. And again, bringing this back round to tip number 1, where I suggested you have a nice wide-angle lens. Wide-angle lenses are particularly good when bringing in a nice, strong foreground into your image, because it's wide enough to bring in detail that is just below the lens and bring that in as the bottom third of your image. So again, it's fantastic to have a wide angle. Something new that I want to start on the channel is to be able to enjoy and even share some of the images that you guys are capturing. So to start off with, what I want you to do is, if you've captured some seascapes recently, or if you're going to head out this week and maybe even try out some of the tips that I've shared in this video, post your seascape images on Instagram. Make sure that you include my tag, that is at Andrew_Marr, and also include the hashtag AMSeascapes. I'll have a look throughout the week, and I might even share some of the images in my next video. I hope the tips that I shared in the video were helpful. If you found the video useful, then please give the video a like. It really does help. And subscribe if you haven't already. If you've got a tip of your own that I might have missed, then make sure you include it in the comments below. But until next time, guys, thanks very much for watching.